Welcome to the Brand Together podcast. Join host Brett Ryan to dive deep and go behind the scenes of successful brand partnerships. Featuring pros from every industry and vertical, from mega brands to startups and everything in between. The Brand Together podcast is essential listening for anyone interested in learning more about brand partnerships. Are you ready? Let's dive into part 2 of a 2-part episode.
Got to meet the minimum threshold of brand and product strength to actually convert those customers and make them part of your camp. That makes sense. Here's a question, piggybacking on your thought about do no harm being a powerful filter, especially for large brands. My perception is there's a number of brands that have just completely solved the awareness problem. Find me someone who's above the age of 6 who doesn't know what McDonald's is, right? I'd put Wendy's, I'd put Dairy Queen has huge awareness. Any one of those QSR brands, Taco Bell, all of those, they've largely solved the awareness problem, particularly in their home markets. And my perception is, I'm going to go back to the McDonald's brand partnerships. My perception is that part of what McDonald's was going for in some of those brand partnerships, they weren't solving an awareness problem. They were trying to solve a relevancy problem. How do we, at BTS, same thing, right? It's like, how do we make our product that, for at least our purposes, the product is good enough to convert to allow us to retain customers from these various partnership ventures? But they're solving a relevancy problem. We need to become more relevant with these target audiences.
Yep.
And so my question is, how do you reconcile for these larger brands, if you're trying to chase relevancy and become more relevant to consumers, how do you reconcile that with sometimes the thing that's most relevant is not necessarily super palatable to your brand? And I'll give you an example. Travis Scott, his meal, the Cactus Jack meal that they did a couple years ago, it was like single-handedly responsible for reversing the sales trends for McDonald's, over a particular quarter or two. But then the whole Astroworld thing happened and people died at a concert, and it's like overnight his brand materially changed. And it's like, how do you reconcile wanting to be hyper relevant and always be in the conversation with the next new thing when maybe the next new thing is eating Tide Pods or something that is really...
Don't do that.
Do you understand what I'm asking? Yeah. How does a large brand...
That is the risk that you take with any partnership, is you give a little bit of exposure to your brand.
Yeah.
To another brand, because now you're together. So that's something. I think that's known. But I think the brands that are managing their consumer and their messaging in the way that they should, they would have a really good idea of what their target demographic is.
Yeah.
Right? Brand, what's the saying? Brand for everyone is a brand for no one.
Yep.
QSR brands generally all have a pretty good idea of who their demographic is. And when they lose their way, you can see the consumer starts to age a little bit. You lose access to the youth or the up-and-coming generations, and you can see a brand just start to die. Like literally, you see it in the consumer base, like people are dying.
Yeah.
And so it's something to watch for. And I think you bring up a relevancy point, which that can be a really strong reason to do a partnership, is not incremental sales, This is just to keep the brand relevant. And you're tapping into this partnership gives us a reason to be relevant, or it gives consumers a new reason to think that we're relevant and reinvent ourselves a little bit. And specifically with F&B brands, there's so much competition in the space. It's always a fight for relevancy.
Yep.
You have to be constantly reinventing yourself a little bit at a time. Eventually it gets to a point of, Theseus's ship, where has it become just something completely different than it started out from? But that's okay, because you have to constantly be reinventing yourself. Better. So relevance is a really good reason that's not a bad reason to do it. It's a very good reason. And it's one it makes a lot of sense if you're keeping the target demographic in mind.
Yep.
If you lose that, then you probably wouldn't be doing it for relevancy, but yeah, it's super important.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's better to the Theseus ship, right? It's better to be a brand new but seaworthy vessel. Right?
Yeah.
Rather than
keeping the legacy brand alive that's just at the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to, and it's easier to palate as well if it's board by board that's being replaced over time versus just like the challenge is a lot of times, sometimes brands wait too long. And it's, listen, we need a new ship. And the consumer, I guess we should probably explain Theseus ship, right? For everybody, is the philosopher's question was, as a ship, Theseus has a ship. And over time, a board on the ship is replaced piece by piece.
Plank by plank.
Plank by plank. At what point is it no longer Theseus's ship and just a completely new ship? And that's the philosophical question. But a lot of time, brand owners will wait too long to do that. And all of a sudden you need a big reinvention of the brand and consumers aren't ready for it. They can't palate it. And I think Cracker Barrel is having that struggle, right? They brought in the new Julie, the new CEO, was ex-CEO of Taco Bell, came over to Cracker Barrel, and they're really struggling. Stock price is way down. She basically came out and said the brand's not relevant to consumers, which Wall Street does not want to hear from the CEO. And they're really struggling, right? And I think that's an example of something that maybe took too long to reinvent itself and update itself over time.
That's such a good example. I totally agree with it. And contrast that with like the Chili's and Applebee's of the world, which I'll be first to say, Chili's and Applebee's, they're boomer brands. Right? But they're really killing it on some of their new menu offerings. I think they're really, especially right now, they're really appealing to like the cheap spot to get, or not cheap, affordable spot.
Value.
The value offering on lunch. I got to up my vernacular for that.
They're killing it. Chili's is doing a great job. And I think it's a really good example of brands that kept the focus on what they are, who they stand for, what they stand for. They didn't try to be everything to everybody. And look, their time and place came, right? When inflation hit, and all these fast food QSR brands started raising their prices, Applebee's and Chili's became ultra affordable. And ultra relevant. And now they're blowing the doors off with some of their offerings. They had a reinvention and they just stayed true to themselves. So they had their struggles, especially when fast casual and came around and literally started stealing their lunch. They stayed true to what they were and their offering. They weathered the storm, and now they're in a great space.
They've replaced a couple of those most worn planks, right? But they've still got the heart of the vessel. No, that's great. I love that. I appreciate you unpacking that for me. Are there any brands that you believe have outstanding, compelling brand partnership opportunities that are just not leveraging, not engaging with them for whatever reason? Let me give a little bit more. You mentioned there's a great filter. I think anyone who is in the room when partnership opportunities are discussed, they know that ideation to actual exit, that filter is huge. The overwhelming majority things die on the cutting room floor. And so maybe it's a little unfair to say who is not leveraging opportunities, but I'm just curious, is there anything you see out there that you're just like, why doesn't someone do this?
That's a good question. The brand I think that comes to mind immediately is Chipotle, which is really super interesting because the latest news, Brian Nichols, CEO of Chipotle, just left to go be CEO of Starbucks, right? So made headline news. What you might not know is Brian Nichols, before he was CEO of Chipotle, he made the news because he was the CEO of Taco Bell, right? Taco Bell is great at partnerships. Doritos Locos Taco, etc. That's kind of part of their game plan to stay relevant. Chipotle doesn't do any. So why is that? I don't know. There's obviously potential there. What I would maybe just theorize is it just hasn't hit the life cycle yet where they've needed to. I think in their international expansion journey, you probably will see them do more partnerships because you are entering into the challenger brand status. And rarely do you just come in and, again, blow the doors off and not need some type of brand equity building that's helping with the consumer. But for whatever reason, Chipotle never really had to do it. As far as I know, in the US and their expansion, their economics were probably just such that, hey, we just keep selling what we're selling. Well, we need to focus on opening more restaurants, not necessarily growing our brand equity. Wherever we go, people love us. So I think that's it. There's obviously potential there when the time comes because it's such a strong brand with such a strong consumer base. But for the most part, they've just kept their operations simple, and they haven't really messed with the branding side of it too much other than their execution.
That makes sense. It begs the question for me. We've talked about it a little bit now, or danced around it a little bit. You mentioned life cycle. There's a particular life cycle in a brand where partnership opportunities probably just make more sense. Mm. And I want to ask, in your perception, what are some indicators that it might be the right time? There's a CPG professional whose insight I respect, he was actually giving some commentary on Crumbl Cookies and some of the brand partnerships they've done. And they've actually done quite a few recently. They did a Olivia Rodrigo cookie recently. They've done a couple other, they did a Beetlejuice thing just recently for the new movie. But in particular, he was talking about they were partnering to expand into new product categories. They partnered with Kellogg's and did the Crumbl cereal. And his commentary on that is, hey, this is, from where I sit, in my experience in CPG suggests to me that this might actually signal some brand weakness. Like, why would you invest your resources in developing a partnered product in a brand new category if there was still a lot of harvesting to be done in our lane, right? And so I've got to ask you, you're talking about life cycle and when partnerships start to make a little bit more sense. What are the key indicators that time has come?
Yeah. No, that's a really good observation. I think that, like you said, that signal of brand weakness is so interesting. And consumers will also pick that up, although more intuitively. Professionals will look at it, like the person that you just mentioned, and say, something seems a little off. Mm-hmm. So, for example, with Crumbl, I think, to your point, I think it does signal, the signal that they're flashing is one of weakness.
Yeah.
What it most likely is one of inexperience. And I've actually met with the founder of Crumbl, Jason McGowan, and in a conversation, he was saying that Crumbl as a brand, the brands that he emulates, I asked him, what brands does he try to look at? And he said, Apple, Disney, Tesla, which I found really interesting because I was expecting F&B brands. Like, what brands do you try to emulate? Who are you chasing after? He mentioned these other different consumer brands that are obviously all very powerful brands, but not F&B. And their current strategy doesn't match anything of what those brands are actually doing if they're doing that. So again, flashes some concerning signs. And the harvest piece is what you mentioned. Like, all these different groups have finite resources to deploy against various initiatives. And I think this can be one of the things, again, going back to Chipotle, maybe why they haven't even necessarily focused on it, is because if there's so much room for growth and so much appetite for your brand and your core offering,
why partner?
Yeah, focus on opening more. Like, it's a lot of work to open restaurants, right? It's very physical. You have a 12 to 18 month timeline. If you're franchising, you got to be recruiting and talking with people and getting them up to speed. You got to do the training. You got to hire. You got to source. There's a lot of work to do with opening restaurants up quickly. And so if you don't have to focus on not just partnerships, not that there's anything wrong with it, if you just don't have to focus on anything else other than that, great, go for it.
Yep.
And when some of that stuff comes out and it's in like machine gun rapid succession mode, it does flash a little bit of weakness where it doesn't seem like it's particularly careful or thoughtful. If you as a consumer look at it and be like, I don't even know why this partnership exists. Yeah. That's probably another sign where you're not on the right track. There's a bit of an art to it. I think you would agree to as well. Even though mathematically it might make sense, it just doesn't feel right.
Yep.
And you can't put your finger on it. It's probably another reason why you should pump the brakes on a particular partnership. Because that's all your intuition telling you that something's not a good fit. Like, these things just don't work. Just like if you were dating, this person's great on paper. We're just not linking. Right? We're just not connecting. And I think that very much is applicable to some of these brand partnerships.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I don't want to pick on Crumbl, by the way. Like, just confession, my wife is like a dyed-in-the-wool, Crumbl. Like, we're Crumblers, right? And
to that point, though, mine is too. I am too.
Yeah.
We haven't, since we've come back to the U.S., we haven't had Crumbl once.
Yeah.
So something's happening there.
Sure.
Where it's like, what's happening with the brand?
Yeah.
What's
going on?
What's going on?
I totally agree. And you mentioned there's something intangible that just doesn't feel right. And if I'm going to put my hat on a little bit here, let's talk about the breakfast cereal. When I think about cookies for breakfast, I think about like Cookie Crisp from like the early 90s. And it wasn't super well received, at least by parents back then. And I think since then, like the packaged cereal environment between now and then is so drastically different, where sugared cereal for breakfast, right? People have, I would argue, there's a fairly strong consumer aversion to products like that for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of it, right? And I don't want to.
What gets even a little bit weirder, right? If you think about it. But if you think about it, sometimes the same thing can be wrong for one group and right for another.
Sure.
You talk about the Crumbl cereal. That feels weird. But then you have what was it? Wendy's did a Frosty cereal.
Yeah.
That feels good.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
But it feels different because of where they're at.
Yeah.
And what they stand for, and one feels desperate.
Yes.
One feels like you're so far off. What are you doing? And the other one is, I wanted that. I didn't realize I wanted that. And you see a lot of these big brands starting to do some of that now. I actually did a bit of an analysis on it. I just walk through Walmart, look for fast food brands. They're everywhere. That wasn't the case 10 years ago.
Sure.
You have Buffalo Wild Wings sauces.
Yeah.
You have Chick-fil-A sauce.
Yeah.
You have P.F. Chang's in the fridge. You know, you have Wendy's chili on the shelves.
Yep.
You have McDonald's coffee. You have Dunkin' Donuts coffee. Like Starbucks. It's everywhere. You can't walk down an aisle now and not see one of these major fast food brands.
Dunkin'. Yeah, all of them. Yeah.
But those are natural iterations,
Yeah.
right? If you start seeing Crumbl already, they're too new. They're 5 years old.
Yeah.
Like, it just feels forced. And that's an example of like the map might look okay, but it feels weird, right? Just your initial reaction on the cereals, right? Like you immediately, like your body language shifted. And that's part of the art of it, I think.
It reminds me of that old conversation about brand permissions. It's like this idea of, do consumers perceive that your brand has the permission to enter into that new product category? And with Crumbl, it's like Clorox could release disinfecting wipes. People are like, oh yeah, cleaning products. That makes sense. They have the permission to do that. That's a very natural, appropriate step. They probably don't have the permission to release peanut butter, right? Yeah. And it's that same thing where it's Wendy's. They've got all these different items. They've got desserts. They've got the fries, the chili, the burger. They've got all these different categories. And as a consumer, it's much more palatable to me that, oh, they're doing something fun with the Frosty brand.
Especially since for so long they haven't done. Like they've just stayed as a...
And it's like they've successfully baby stepped that brand to new and exciting places. The ones they've been doing recently is just kind of new flavors. The Orange Dream or the Triple Berry or whatever. They're very appropriately expanding the permissions around the Frosty brand. And so Wendy's has done that. I think it's much more palatable to consumers. And they say, yeah, I want that because they've got such a beloved brand in the Frosty. It's like Crumbl Cookie. You guys are a cookie company. You do cookies. For me personally, I still go in there and I'm like, oh, okay, what are the new cookies? Oh, there's a cake? Why do you guys
and even they changed their branding around. They went through that whole process, right? Where all of a sudden, hey, we're not just cookies. Now we're Crumbl.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's a great idea.
Yeah.
And then you see one of the other founders start another brand, Crust Club.
Yeah.
What is now you're in pies? Like you are 5 years old and you have 1,000 restaurants.
Yeah.
This feels wrong.
Yeah.
Like it feels like you're either giving the feel that something is off or something actually is off. Right? And the consumers pick up on it. It feels weird. You don't like it. And you just get the ick. Right? Gen Z, you just get ick. And you're just kind of, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't put my finger on it, but I'm a consumer. I love the cookies.
Yeah, me
despite
too.
the calorific implications.
Oh, yeah.
And I haven't been back.
It's an interesting thought experiment on what consumers will, quote, allow, unquote, brands to do. So I want to go back to something we were just talking about, to partner or not to partner. One pithy way to describe that is in order for a partnership to make sense, it's like the 1 + 1 must equal 3, right? We've got to get more out of that unless we're going to, like some of the brands we discussed today, let's just deploy our resource, Chipotle, right? Let's
Yeah.
just deploy our own resources on our own initiatives. We're always battling for budget, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is, if you are a young brand, you're a small brand, you have not solved the awareness problem, how do you make that decision? Let's say you haven't fully solved the awareness problem, but you've got opportunities to do partnerships. Maybe this reminds you of a brand, maybe it doesn't. But if I'm an operator at one of those brands, how should I be thinking about whether or not we just double down on our own initiatives or whether we apportion some of our resources for partnerships and that kind of thing? Is there...
Yeah, I think your track record of success will determine that a little bit. So I'm assuming like if you're a young brand and you're evaluating that, maybe you don't have the level of sales or there's room for sales that you just want more exposure. I think the first thing that I would evaluate is, are you ready for the spotlight? So is your brand and the brand that you've built, are you ready for exposure?
Yeah.
Because that's what you're aiming for with a partnership is exposure, right?
Yep.
You're going to piggyback on hopefully leverage the power of an existing brand to drive trial, to drive awareness.
Yep.
Are you ready for it? And there is a bit of a life cycle there. We keep using that word. There's a bit of a life cycle there as well. There's a natural evolution and a safe space to build your brand. You're not going to be perfect and you're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
But if a brand got too much exposure too fast, just like a plant that got too much sunlight, it's going to die.
Yeah.
So it has to be ready to withstand what's coming, to withstand the exposure, the trial, the feedback, our consumer's going to resonate with it. So if there's room for that and you think you're ready, then I think as a challenger brand, as a growing brand, there'd be no downside to it. You'd want to partner with whoever you could, the biggest brand to work with you. The other brand that's partnering with you could be looking at it we talked about. There could be a variety of reasons why they would choose to partner with a young and upcoming brand. Mm-hmm. I think it's probably not possible to pin them all down, but that would be that type of 1 + 1 = 3 that you're looking for as you find a brand that it works for.
Yep.
But you got to be ready.
Yeah.
Like your brand has to be built enough, and you're building the plane a little bit as well as you're flying it with a new brand. You have to be able to check and adjust and continue to focus on building your brand and not just focus on the partnerships, which I think maybe, again, not to go back to Crumbl, sorry to pick on them, but like maybe that's why it felt a little off.
Yeah.
It's like they're still just 5 years old. They literally are still building their brand. And so when you start to see the rapid partnerships, it distracts from maybe a little bit of what they're doing. And it again, the consumers just pick it up as it feels off versus just doing fewer and better.
Yeah.
Find ones that really work and go for that as a brand building. But I think if you have experienced professionals, experienced brand builders as part of your organization, that is something that is more natural. With any organization as you grow, if you're not growing your expertise and it's a balance. You're always looking at what got us here. Like what was it, our group? Was it our core group of founders and professionals? Or was it our brand? Or was it what we built? And as you would know from business school case studies, every brand, every business gets to the point where sometimes the founders are actually blocking the success versus taking things to the next level. Yep. So you've got to be willing to step aside and hire the right people and bringing experience. There's people that do this. That's all they do. You got to pay for it. And I think it can save you you're going to learn the lessons one way or the other. You can pay for them, or you can learn them yourselves and also pay for them, right? And just also, in cost of sales.
That makes sense. I love that answer. Are you ready for the spotlight? And I'm going to pick on Crumbl some more too. I'm sorry. I love Crumbl, but
please send us a box of cookies.
Yeah. You want to sponsor the podcast? We'll pick on you every week, Crumbl. No. And honestly, it is a brand I admire. And let me just do a quick aside. Sorry, listeners. I really do value that we can have some candid conversations about branding here. And I share this in love and appreciation, but one of the things, being ready for the spotlight. Let's talk about that. I'm like somewhere between a 3 and 5 hour a week Redditor. I browse the forums. My wife, she actually has me looking at the Crumbl Cookie Reddit forum to see what the upcoming cookie thing. That's how we dial in and know what's coming. But on those forums, you can see the cracks in the consumer perception of the brand. Are they ready for the spotlight? In some cases, I would say, no, here's an easy one. I think their employer branding is not super strong. You get on Reddit and you're like, oh man, we're overworked, or why are people posting underbaked cookies and this, that, and the other thing? And there's all these kind of frayings around the brand. And you want to talk about, there's a joke, the employer branding for McDonald's, literally like a part of our larger American culture is, oh, burger flippers, right? Oh, that's, you make your living in fast food. Like it's literally like a cultural in-joke. But over time, they've had a very mature approach to that idea by saying, hey, we've got a scholarship fund. We've got this, we've got this. They've really positioned their employer branding around acknowledging and owning that. And it becomes almost more of a strength. You don't necessarily see some of that maturity with a younger brand like Crumbl. And it's, are you ready for the spotlight? I don't know if you,
And to your point, like I've noticed some of the same things, and I won't go into too many details. I've known some people that have moved on and had their experiences. They, as a brand, they did something that is almost unprecedented. To get to a $1 billion brand, $1 billion in sales is probably worth more than that. 1,000 locations in 5 years. 1,000 locations. Incredible. And they're highly fragmented. Mom and pops, 1-2s. It's not some big group that's behind them. So the economics were just amazing. Yeah. And the drive there. But they've hit this wall for everything that we've been discussing. And I think it's probably to the point now where the longer they hold it, the more they'll actually degrade the brand.
Sure.
So on the record, they need to sell the brand, and the longer they hold it, the more value they'll erode because of everything that you're talking about. Were you ready for the spotlight? It needs to go rapidly into professional mode.
Yeah.
And the longer that you're not there, the more you're going to struggle. Yeah. And so they did some amazing things. Be proud, be grateful of it. Capitalize.
Sure.
Right? Sail off into the sunset.
Sure.
And or you have to rapidly transform the brand. And I'm not sure anybody there has the organizational capabilities to rapidly transform an organization of that size in a it's not a knock on. They're still trying to figure out how to franchise.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. One of the big things was they had to do a franchise disclosure document.
Yeah.
Which is one of the must-dos when you get to a certain size. And that's what started some of the traction, because you got visibility into some of the stuff. But they're just barely 5 years old. No brand has 1,000 units and is 5 years old.
Yeah.
Nobody.
Yeah.
So it's amazing and scary and indicative, I think, all of it at the same time is what needs to happen. So the easiest thing to maintain value, maintain the brand, ensure the legacy would be to transition quickly. The name is built, the brand is built, locations are there. It just needs to move on to a different set of hands, I think.
Yeah.
And that's difficult because it's emotional, right? Brands are emotional. People don't necessarily always make the right financial decision or the brand decision because this is their baby.
Yeah.
And I can empathize with that 100%, but I think that's probably what's holding back the brand the most. Is it has the risk of becoming a case study of somebody that held on too long.
Yep.
So hopefully we don't see that in the Harvard Review 5 to 10 years.
I agree, and hope they do well too. Okay, so I want to change gears here real quick, just to give you some context about the listener audience a little bit. A portion of our audience, small business owners, small business operators, the kind of folks who potentially might be interested in franchising a QSR concept at some point. Given your expertise and your experience in franchising, what advice would you give to franchisees when they are evaluating potential franchising partners?
So I think let's make it 2 parts. We'll broaden it to anybody that is franchising or licensing. If you're the owner, we'll take it from the owner's perspective, and then somebody that would be the receiver of a brand. If you're the owner, we talked a little bit about it. You would evaluate franchising or licensing essentially if you think somebody else can do better or faster in the growth of your brand. So if they can operate it better in a particular market, that could be a reason. If they can grow faster than you could yourself with access to capital, investment, etc., then that could be the case. And if both of those things are together, then that's a pretty good reason, right, to start. So that's how you can really get exposure and growth If the answer is no to one or both of those things, then really you need to be like, why am I franchising? Because I think people sometimes underestimate the amount of effort and organization that comes with being a franchisor. There's regulatory constraints at a certain size. Even if you're private, you basically get treated like a public company with franchise disclosures, et cetera. There's a lot of rigor and experience and infrastructure that has to be built if that's the group that you're going to be. And a lot of times people underestimate that. And what happens is they start to do the franchising. And when you franchise, you're essentially giving control, management over your brand to somebody else. Yep. And if you do that too early as a franchisor, without the infrastructure and G&A to manage that process and be stewards of your brand, what happens is you just run the risk of brand damage, which can be minimal to extensive and essentially kill your product, along with all the other stuff that we've already talked about. So that's on the franchisor side. If you're a franchisee, and I've been on both sides, I like to look for people that exemplify, organizations that exemplify all the things that we were talking about a little bit. I want somebody who's going to tell me what their brand is. Yeah. I want somebody that shows me and exemplifies that they have a support structure to be part of this franchise partnership. I want my royalties that I pay to them or my license fees to be going towards something, not just the owner or the franchisor's bank account. There needs to be some support structure. Do they understand the markets that I'm in? Are they adding value? Does it have a proven business model? And that's all the stuff that's outside maybe of the financial return calculations. Obviously, those have to make sense. But those are the things that I think get overlooked and that people can miss when they're making those decisions because they just don't have experience on that side of the world. Franchising is actually a relatively small group, if you think about it, in the broader business world. Yeah. And having experience with that can be really valuable. Yep. And so sometimes as a new franchisee, if you're a mom and pop, you want to open up one location, one restaurant, one gym, one whatever, you might not have experience with those things. And you can get taken advantage of, which is not right, but it happens. You want to make sure that you understand the royalties and the obligations that come with being a franchisee. And when you're signing those franchise agreements, a lot of times they'll come with remodel obligations over a certain amount of time and reinvestment into brands and stuff like that. You just want to make sure all those things make sense. And if you're just really eager to get a brand and you sign on the dotted line without reading through some of those things or getting really good advice, you can get into a sticky situation. Yeah, for sure.
No, that makes sense. No, that's good. That's applicable advice, which is exactly what we're going for. Dr. Guthrie, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. We'll have to have you back soon.
Of course.
I mean, there's a lot of ground we could cover. You're an expert that I've admired for a long time and certainly respect. And so I always relish the opportunity to chop it up a little bit and just...
We didn't even talk about the fact that the most impressive accomplishment is being a graduate from, of course, the prestigious Bonneville High School. In Idaho Falls.
That's some...
It's a very select, limited, prestigious...
There's some deep lore for you and I. Yeah, no, we go way back. I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for your friendship throughout the years.
No, I'm glad to be on and really impressed and glad that Brand Together, the book and the podcast, now made it into this space. I think it's something that was really needed. There was definitely a gap because you see a lot of it, but there's not a lot of material or discussion about some of these partnerships. It's just kind of something that I think you would understand definitely as a marketer and probably was the genesis of why you did it, but it's prevalent in the space, but it actually doesn't get a lot of focus too much.
It's crazy to me that there aren't more conversations about this kind of thing. Like just the few brands and businesses that we've discussed, we're talking about billions of dollars of consumer preference. These partnerships, these brands, drive billions of dollars in consumer spending. And it's crazy to me that I appreciate that. Thank you for the kind words.
No, it's been a pleasure.
Brandon, tell our listener audience, if they want to find you, if they want to engage with you, where do we find you? What's going on with you right now?
LinkedIn is probably the easiest place to find me. Just Dr. Brandon Guthrie on LinkedIn. You'll find me pretty quick. I'm probably the most boring LinkedIn influencer out there. So that's where I make my space. And then You can follow me on Instagram at Idaho Boy Meets World and see where I'm at in the world. But yeah, that's where you find me.
I love it. No, I'd arm wrestle you for the most boring LinkedIn. Instagram. I'm pretty boring there myself as well. But at any rate, it was an absolute pleasure. I'd love to have you back again in the near future.
Yep, anytime.
Wonderful. Thank you again.
This has been part 1 of a 2-part episode of the Brand Together podcast. Join us again next week for part 2, along with more brand partnership insights. And remember to subscribe to the Brand Together podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or anywhere else podcasts are found.